for having me. It's a great joy to see folks from all over the country and outside of the United States. And um, I've been serving both in church plants and now at a remissioning situation. The church that I currently serve at, First Baptist Church Ashland, is actually over 160 years old, and I've been there for not quite 5 years, but it's been an incredible gift to serve there. Um, and Today we're going to talk about some of the principles that we've actually lived out together. What we're talking about today isn't just abstract theory. These are tried and true practices. These are things I researched, but also have been living out in my current context and in serving and coaching pastors from all over the place. And so I hope that you'll find it helpful. And also, my guess is that some of it will be a little challenging along the way. And so I look forward to hearing your questions as we move through some of the content today. The first thing we're going to talk a little bit about is what is remissioning leadership. We use that phrase, but what do we actually mean by that? And so I've got a slide for you that hopefully gives you a little bit of a definition for what that means. Remissioning leadership, in kind of the most simplest terms, is empowering people to experience their own transformation so that the mission of God can flourish. In established churches, you'll often find people talking about all kinds of leadership, and they mean it to have something to do with strategic vision, the number of programs they hold, the number of people that are coming. But in our context, when we talk about remissioning a church, we're looking for leaders who are recognizing that what's really at stake is that we want people to feel empowered to live out their own transformation as they follow God. And not just so that the church will grow, but even more so that the mission of God in that community will flourish and that the church will wake up and participate in that mission in deep ways. That means that as leaders and as churches, you're gonna have to kind of wrestle through some areas of vulnerability, recognizing that perhaps some of the programs, events, work that you've done, even things you've done for a long time, may have to be recalibrated or even pruned. It looks like leaders who are willing to share power. It looks like perhaps the kind of typical pyramid in a church setting of how power works and is shared has to get disrupted a bit. But the idea here in remissioning leadership is that this isn't something that happens to people, but both the leaders and the community of that we would call a church are being transformed from the inside out for their own sake and for the sake of the community that God's inviting them to be on mission with. And so remissioning is creating the opportunity for folks to kind of recalibrate their understanding of what it means to be the church. This is about real lives being transformed, not simply attending a set of programs or events. And so how do we get to live out these remissioning principles? Well, it really begins with a spirituality of weakness. And so I've got a slide here that kind of talks a little bit about what that means. To give some reference, when I moved to Ashland, I went from a church plant where the average age of folks was in their 30s and to mid 40s. And when I started at this church, I had to buy 4 suits to start this job. Now, that might not mean much to you, but I traded in my jeans and boots and an unbuttoned collar for striped ties and loafers and suits. And on the surface, a suit and tie is really not a big deal. But somewhere along the line, you realize that as a leader, these changes that just seem on the surface and on the outside, they really were nothing compared to the transformation that God was going to ask to come from within my own being, within my own spiritual life with God. The transformation of established churches really relies on transformation of leaders. They have to be willing to do some real excavation work in their own hearts, in their spiritual practices, and the way that they're living their lives. And so when we talk about a spirituality of weakness, what do we mean by that? On the slide, you'll see Philippians 2:5-8. This is really the heartbeat of the spirituality of weakness. It says, in your relationships with one another, have the same mindset as Christ Jesus, who being in very nature God, did not consider equality with God something to be used to his own advantage. Rather, he made himself nothing, taking the very nature of a servant, being made in human likeness, and being found in the appearance as a man, he humbled himself by becoming obedient to death, even death on a cross. The power of this passage of scripture, and we see Jesus making this descent to be present with people, and not just present with them in an eye-to-eye way, but actually being willing to take on the posture and the attitude of a servant, washing the disciples' feet. We have these stories of what it means to actually appear weak, to diminish your role, your office, what you are living like in the context of community. And we see this incredible humility, this willingness to serve other people. Even for Jesus, the idea that being the very nature of God didn't consider that as something to be used to his own advantage, but he made himself nothing. And there's this incredible power in the way that we see and understand Jesus, that what it means to have a spirituality of weakness is that we model our own leadership after the life of Christ, who was willing to lay down his life and look with such an incredible kind of posture of humility with the people that he served and lived life with. And so as we think about how to apply a spirituality of weakness in our everyday lives and our leadership, what this looks like to me is that you have to be willing to practice the presence of God with people. In established churches, it's often easy for a pastor to kind of separate themselves. Anybody ever been to a church where the pastor has their own parking spot? Yeah, I'm guessing some of you have. What does it look like for you to practice presence where you're not separating yourself out, but actually living in close proximity with people? What are the special parking spots in your leadership that you actually need to avoid and able to, in order to actually live in closer proximity to the people that God's asking you to serve with? Um, in living this out, it means that you show up, you're present not only to other people's lives, but you're also present with your own life to allow people to see you for who you are, not just in your strengths, not just behind a pulpit, but actually know part of who you are as a person in your life, in your family. Another really important part of how to apply a spirituality of weakness in remissioning an established church is that you as a leader are going to have to be willing to acknowledge, address, and navigate some of the real pain that exists in your own life, some of the areas of brokenness and sin that exist for you. If you walk around believing that you, all the accolades that people might say about your preaching or the way you led a meeting or the way that you were there for them in a hard time, and you never take time to acknowledge the real pain, that perhaps you really did lose your cool with your kids before they left for school that day, or maybe you haven't been as thoughtful with your spouse as you have been for someone at church, and you don't acknowledge real pain that's going on underneath the surface. For one, that's going to end up wreaking havoc in your own life, but for two, it will actually create an unhealthy connection with you as a pastor. And so you have to be willing to look under the surface beyond the things that other people can see to actually do the real soul work before God and with others that helps you to experience transformation in your own soul. If you don't continue to find places in your life where you have to repent and recalibrate and ask for forgiveness, it's going to be really difficult for you to lead a church that's going to have to do some of those things themselves. The last part of having a clear and important kind of emphasizing a spirituality of weakness is to recognize that the transformation of established churches requires your own transformation too, that there is no easy button for you in this process either. There's not going to be some place where the church gets to just press this magical button and everything just opens up and everyone gets excited because you've asked them to have a guitar and worship for the first time, or move the discipleship hour to a different time. Like, people aren't going to magically just turn the corner on a lot of these things. And so you as a leader have to be willing to ask tough questions about what's going on in your own life that might need to move and transform as you're asking other people to transform. This can't just be, they're going to change and just start to be more like me. You have to be willing to change and evolve as well. The really big question that I think about in this space is, um, how might your weakness, both within yourself and for you externally as a community of people, give room for Christ to be strong? It is so easy for us as leaders to allow a charismatic personality, our ability to run a meeting, or for us as churches to have a flashy website and have all these great widgets that might attract people to our church, but not actually do the very things that allow us to allow Christ to be strong in our midst. And so it's really important in an established church to actually show the cracks, to show the places where God needs to do work to transform you, and not just have all these flashy, fun things that attract people but don't actually change who they are from the inside out. After a spirituality of weakness, another core principle to remissioning an established church is something called creative destruction. Now, when I think about creative destruction, I'm guessing that you've all thought about this some, but perhaps you haven't thought about it in the context of your church. I wish there was a way to have you like raise your hand, but just think about the way that music has changed, the way that you consume music has changed over the course of your life. I still have 2 record players, so we've got vinyl. What happens after vinyl? Cassettes, move on eventually to CDs, then MP3s, and then who even buys MP3s anymore? We just stream everything. In the music industry, do you think that the cassette makers were really excited when CDs came out? Not so much. The very format that they had built a business around, helped people to consume music, stereos in cars, stereos in homes. Cassette makers weren't really excited about the advent of CDs. And in church situations, we have a similar kind of thing, where as the Spirit is moving and doing new work, it's really difficult sometimes for us to let go of outdated formats and ways of communication, ways of being the church, not because we just want to get rid of them, but so that we can more effectively be a part of what God's asking us to do. And so the definition that I offer up to you today for creative destruction is: creative destruction is an active dying so that something new might emerge. Creative destruction is an active dying so that something new might emerge. This is beautifully inherent in our story as Christians, right? Like the very thing that we talk about that is core to what it means to be a follower of Jesus is that we believe that his life, death, and resurrection shapes our very world. It's the very narrative in which our churches are supposed to orient their lives around. And something that I think is interesting about churches is that we forget that Jesus didn't resurrect from already living. Like Jesus had to die. And so part of creative destruction is wrestling with this question: how do we embrace the cross as established churches as a pathway to resurrection? The root issue to me in so many established churches is that we have too often left out that taking up our cross and following Jesus as part of the way that we disciple people and share the gospel is actually a core principle for what it means to be church. Somewhere along the line, we stopped preaching that part of the gospel, that in order to live in community, in order to be church, in order to follow Jesus, we must also take up our cross and follow. Instead, we keep buying into the myth of addition. So the myth of addition is that we can keep adding and adding and adding without ever pruning, without ever repenting, without turning from the things that we've always done. And this looks like when I arrived at this one established church that I worked with, I noticed when I walked around their building that they had over 20 different bins for organizations that they could donate to in their community. Everything from socks for people experiencing homelessness, soap for this homeless shelter. There was stuff for flood relief in another box, and on with all these really good things. But they just kept adding and adding ways for people to participate without ever saying, is this actually core to what God's asking us to do? And there was never pruning going involved in some of the programming and events. And so uh, that myth of constant addition, that we can keep adding and adding to our established churches without them ever crumbling under the weight, is really a lie. It burns people out. It makes people drop out and leave. Part of the challenge for an established church in living out creative destruction is that we have to be honest with one another and in our churches about Jesus's expectations for our shared life together. I don't know if anyone remembers this little kind of interesting parable from Luke chapter 13. But after Jesus kind of has a water cooler conversation with a few of the disciples, he tells a story about the parable of a fig tree. Now, this fig tree has been existing in this garden of fig trees, and for whatever reason, for years, it hasn't been producing. And so the owner finally comes and says, you know what, it's time to cut this fig tree down. We need to be done with it. It's not producing the very fruit that it needs to produce. But the gardener catches wind that the owner of the garden wants to cut it down. And so the gardener says, would you please, like, give me a year. I'm going to put all this manure and fertilizer around it to give it a shot to grow some stuff again. And if it doesn't after a year, then you can cut it down. And so the parable of this story from Jesus is that if the fig tree doesn't bear figs, it will be cut down. And for some reason in established churches, we have bought into this idea that Jesus is content if we simply survive. That we don't have to thrive, we don't have to be fruitful, we don't actually have to live this stuff out in such a way that our community and our lives are different people in different places. And that's just not true. God really desires for our established churches to bear fruit that is consistent with the Lord, that we say is guiding our lives and empowering our hearts. And so one of the challenges for established churches in living out creative destruction is to wrestle with this idea: is, are we in survival mode, or are we actually bearing fruit consistent with the gospel? Now, to actually practice creative destruction means that you have to be intentional in disrupting your church in such a way that it gives them the opportunity to get back into the life cycle where it's building up and potentially growing, not just in numbers, but in maturity, rather than simply being on the decline and malforming disciples. And so on this chart, on that same slide on creative destruction, you'll see an example of what it looks like for churches to live out creative destruction. So creative destruction, to me, you have these opportunities to kind of intentionally disrupt yourself, prune, ask the hard questions of what it looks like to be alive again. And to do that, there's kind of four main pathways in my research that I've seen. One is to reimagine, one is to reset, one's to restart, and one's to resurrect. Now, the dotted lines in this chart represent the kind of pathway from where you're at on the life cycle as a church. And that's something that you have to kind of wrestle with as a group of leaders. So are you growing? Are you experiencing maturity? Are people really living out their faith? Are you in a place of plateau? Are you declining? And don't just think about numbers, think about the real depth of what kinds of disciples are being created in your context. And these dotted lines represents the pathways back into new life as a community, as a church. The healthiest churches will actually practice reimagination regularly. They see it as a healthy practice. They intentionally disrupt and prune to keep the mission of God at the center of what they're doing. Churches that have to reset have already kind of passed the point of plateau spiritually and numerically. And it happens, and churches that need to reset, this usually happens when they become unclear about their mission and they're seeing decline, not just in numbers, but in the kinds of healthy disciples that are being made in their discipleship groups. You might hear people in churches that need to reset, they just feel a little lost. They might call it mission drift. They feel a little kind of lost at sea. They're asking questions like, what are we doing and why are we doing it? To reset a church practicing creative destruction is to attempt to kind of address the wandering that happens when a church loses its way. To restart is a much more dramatic work. You're seeing a church decline numerically. You're seeing a decline in the quality of disciples that it's creating in its midst. And this church recognizes that without drastic changes, it's kind of all over. And so one of the ways you talk about this is to restart a church is when the end goal of that church, the way that it's been living out its mission and making disciples, it needs to be recalibrated or completely revamped. In this phase, a church has usually allowed survival to dictate the way that it behaves, the way it lives its life together. And in this sense, folks really start to get worried and complacent, and they usually have turned so inwardly that without a dramatic restart, they struggle to get back into a place where they can be alive again. The last way of talking about creative destruction is resurrection. And this is the most thorough and one of the hardest parts, is when a church not only has declined so far that most of its people are gone, but it's recognized the way that it's living its shared life together is without significant death and resurrection, it's just not going to be able to go forward. Often a church in this space, all of its leadership usually has to go. That's not just staff, but it's also churches, the leadership that helped them to get into this situation in the first place. The last kind of element and competency of remissioning an established church I'd like to talk about today is traditioned innovation. Before we put this slide up, I want to give you a little context. There's a great story from the comic strip Peanuts, with Charlie Brown and Lucy. And the context of this strip that I'm going to show you in just a second is that for a few seasons now, Charlie Brown and Lucy's baseball team, they've just never won a game. They just lose every season. But for some reason, in this new season of baseball, they just have a ton of hope. And so they've been really excited to play, get back on the field. And Charlie Brown throws the first pitch out, and the person takes a hit, swings, and sends this long fly ball to Lucy in the outfield. And she's ready to catch the ball. She's got the glove right there. She's smiling and eager, and then the ball misses the glove and hits her right in the face. And so now this comic strip on this slide, you'll see that she's walking the ball back to Charlie Brown. And she says to Charlie, "Sorry, I missed that easy fly ball, manager. I thought I had it, but suddenly I remembered all the others I've missed, and the past got in my eyes." The past got in my eyes. Does this sound familiar to any of your established churches? The past got in our eyes. Sometimes it's our past successes that we've been unable to replicate, or it's our failures that keep us from moving beyond our traditions into a faithful expression for what it looks like to be on mission with God today. You'll see at the bottom of that same slide a quote from the great theologian Jaroslav Pelikan about the difference between a church thinking about traditionalism and tradition. And he says, "Traditionalism is the dead faith of the living, and tradition is the living faith of the dead." Now, none of us would be here if the saints hadn't passed on the faith through the church in all of its good ways and broken ways over our history. But in remissioning our established church, we have to be careful to recognize that there's a difference between traditionalism, this is how we've always done it, and this is how we'll always do it, versus a tradition that is living, that needs perhaps some revitalization that we can pass on to other generations. In remissioning your established church, the context always matters. Where people came from, how they gather, what stories shape their fears and their imaginations, what events in their community act as anchor points, the places, the histories, even the idols that produce shame in them. Context matters so much. And the idea of tradition innovation is that the stories, the people, the hopes, the dreams, the fears Um, all of those things, you have to learn them because they form a kind of living tradition that the church passes down among the generations in order to help them to learn how to be faithful as the church in the days ahead. So the question here is, how do you be innovative without killing tradition itself? One of the most surprising things for me in learning how to really embrace tradition, but also not get stuck in it, has been um, just the sheer number of funerals that an established church may have to do. So in my context, I've done 56 funerals in 55 months. And every single funeral has taught me so much. It's helped me to learn through proximity of relationship what's important to people, about how to live in community with people whose life experiences are really different from mine. You learn about what stories, what grief, what joy has oriented their life. You see, established churches are not lost at sea, but the sea is really stormy. It is really challenging because people are watching their traditions, their way of being church, the way that they consume their faith. So much has changed and they don't know what to do. It's not an easy time to be an established church or to be an established church pastor. And so when I think about how to put tradition to innovation into practice, one of the core things is that you have to be present. You have to know people. You need to live like you are a new person in that community, even if you've been there for a long time. What does it look like for you to kind of put glasses on and imagine what it's like to be new in that place? What are the hopes and dreams of that community? What are their stories? What are the things they pass down? Another thing about tradition innovation is that in an established church, when you try to change things, you can't just change it because you want to change it. You need to be able to communicate why that change is important and how it helps you to live out the mission of God in a new way. And a big part of that is helping folks to wrestle through how they can bury their preferences as part of the bigger mission of God. When people can see the end goal in mind, they're willing to try some new things. But if they can't understand why you're doing what you're doing, why you're asking them to love a neighbor that's uncomfortable for them to love, why it's important for them to allow new hymns or songs to be a part of the work you're doing, if you don't give them space to understand the why, it's going to be really difficult for them to follow you into that new future. So for me, kind of the last part of tradition innovation is helping your folks to embrace the cross by bearing their preferences for the sake of a bigger mission. And when they understand the why, that you want people of all different shapes and sizes to really grow into healthy disciples for the sake of the world, it just makes such a huge difference. So that's all I've got to say today in terms of the kind of core principles about spirituality of weakness and tradition innovation and creative destruction. But I look forward to hearing some questions. Yeah.
Josh, thanks so much. I know you well and know that this content comes from a place of practice for you, and you have lived into this. And so I actually want to ask you a question off script.
Yeah.
And I want to talk about, I'd like you to speak to the personal suffering and pain that a remissioning leader experiences in trying to remission others. I know that just from my own experience that in leading people someplace where they don't know they want to go or don't think they need to go, that sometimes you experience that conflict and that backlash, and so I'd like you to speak to just some of the reality of the suffering in a remissioning leader.
Yeah. So if you as a leader are unwilling to embrace the cross, it's going to be really difficult for you to help your established church to find its way into the future. Um, you're going to have to be willing to allow God to expose brokenness and sin within your own heart, pride, ego, your desire to get your own way. You're going to have best laid plans that you're going to have to lay down at the cross and allow people to say, hey, this isn't the right fit for us right now, or we're not sure that we can follow you into that space. You're going to have to be willing to give up and lay down some of your own preferences as a leader too. You're going to have to be willing to to spend some time really wrestling before God to say, God, am I the right person? Do I have the skills that these folks need? You're going to have to do some real deep soul searching um, in the pathway of remissioning a church. As a leader, it will cost. There will be tears, there'll be anger, there'll be frustration. There will be people who will insult your character. They're going to be folks who are going to ask you questions because they are experiencing such doubt and loss because of how much change they're having to appropriate in order to be church on mission again, that they're going to need sometimes a scapegoat to blame. And so there are going to be times for you as a leader that you're going to have to take things and hear things that aren't comfortable to hear. It may not actually be true about who you are, but you're going to have to develop the emotional health and awareness to not hold those things so personally, while also helping the church continue to walk forward.
Thanks, Josh. The remissioning process. My curiosity is what does success look like for a remissioning church? What does it tell us of success? How do you measure that? I mean, the success is a word that is used, all the time in and outside the church. And so I'm wondering what that success looks like in this work.
Yeah, that's a great question. So when I think about what a success or what does it look like for an established church to remission and be fruitful again, one of the big things is that you have to develop new metrics for what it looks like to be a healthy church. Most established churches spend the bulk of their time counting things and defining those things as success. How many people did we have? How much money? What was our attendance like in our discipleship groups? They spend the bulk of their time counting things, whether it's inputs, money, people, or outputs, things like programs, events, things that they can literally count and tangibly see. But the question is your established church actually asking the questions, what do we measure on whether or not those inputs, the people, the money, the resources, the events, the programs that we do, are they actually, what are the outcomes of those things that we can count? Are we having disciples that are mature, that work hard to see each other intergenerationally? Do we have people who are more welcoming of their neighbor of a different culture, race, or ethnicity? Is our community actually a better place? One of the questions that I think an established church always has to wrestle with is if your church, and if it has a building or not, and all the people associated with it were sort of to get inside of that building and a sinkhole opened up and it disappeared, would your community ever notice or care? And for me, if your community isn't able to see that the outcome of your being church is that the kingdom of God is more present in that place, that there's flourishing happening in your community, lives are being changed, families are healthier, then you have a real problem. You're counting things. You may grow numerically, but you may not actually be achieving the outcomes that you need to have. And so one of the things that established churches need to do is to have new metrics of success. And that also means that it's not about winning. It's not about having the largest church, but it's actually our people experiencing deep transformation in their context and as a group of people.
Thanks, Josh.
Josh, thanks for leading us through such helpful content based on your personal study and experience. We have some questions from our attendees. One of them is, are there some corporate spiritual practices that you invite the congregation into that help them connect with God's invitation to move to a new place?
Yeah. So now, depending on your context and where people are at and where you're on that kind of life cycle that I put up earlier in creative destruction, your practices will depend, to a large degree on what your context is like. But so for us, one of the things that we did in order to practice taking up our cross and seeing and being with each other is that when I first started at the church that I currently serve, we had two different worship services. We had an 8:30 contemporary service, and then we had an 11 o'clock traditional service. Our contemporary service really wasn't contemporary. There wasn't any support for families. And we had this like 700 person sanctuary, and there'd be like 50 to 100 people in there. And then we had a traditional service that was, much more formal and traditionally like strong organ, choir, and it'd be anywhere between 100, 150, kind of on average, again, in a 700 person sanctuary. And we realized that if we were going to be one church figuring out how to be on mission together, that we needed to bury some of our worship preferences in order to follow Jesus together for our community. And so we took some time, we prayed and thought about it. We actually had some folks help us to wrestle through some of those questions. And we actually had, we stopped having two different worship services, and we met in the middle. And we didn't just blend a service, we actually did things that we had never done before in worship together. And we had more generations present, and we asked different people to be involved and had normally been involved in worship. And so we made a strong effort to create a communal space where we practiced bearing our preferences together. And we did that for a season of time, and then the church actually decided to keep up that practice. Another communal practice we do is prayer walks, where we actually pray through our community. So we actually try to imagine, how do we see with God's eyes what it looks like to be on mission in our community? And so instead of just praying that sitting in our own space, we actually go walk together around our schools, around our businesses, and we pray for people in our community. So communal practices are really, really important.
Great, thank you. Another question, you mentioned contemporary versus traditional. How does that contemporary versus traditional conversation fit in the remissioning conversation? So like, to put it another way, is this another way just to make our church modern or contemporary? And if so, if not, how would you answer a potential critic's concern about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So for me, the mode of worship, if we're just talking about contemporary or traditional, that really doesn't determine a remissioning church. What does determine a remissioning church, in my estimation, is whether or not the church is alive to the mission of God anymore, or simply trying to attract people into its building or space. And so whether it's contemporary or traditional in terms of its format of worship, that doesn't matter as much. I will say that it would be odd for a church, contemporary or traditional, to not make some stronger attempt to have its worship reflect the language of the people that they're trying to actually communicate the good news to. But that doesn't mean that it has to have contemporary or traditional wrappings. Like, those things aren't essential. And in fact, I would say they really boil down to preferences, even though some folks would not describe it that way. The wrappings of how worship happens are not as essential as the outcome of what our worship is producing in us as a group of people. It's a great question.
Thanks, Caleb, for asking that. So what do we do with people who cannot make the transition and transformation? So the assumption is that there's a leader who's leading the change, and there may be a few blockers. Do you ask the blockers to leave? Do you counsel them out? And what is the process to resolve that tension?
So it's really important for a while, for a few years, to be honest, that you work really hard to bring as many people with you as you can without forsaking those values that you believe are really important to live out the mission. When I was interviewing at the church I currently serve, they asked that very question, like, what do you do when some people don't want to go? And I had a mentor kind of share an image with me one time, and I just adapted it a little bit. For me, when a church is walking towards a future together, you're going to have some folks who get tired, their feet wear out. They might even get a little frustrated. They don't like where you're going, and they might resist a little bit. You might even have some who sit down in the road and throw a fit and say, I'm not going, and you can't make me. As long as people are kind of holding hands and walking somewhere together, you can keep moving forward. If someone stops, you ask them to keep walking with you. If someone stops and sits in the middle of the road and they're throwing a fit, you go back to them and you invite them along the way. But at some point, You can't hold on forever just for one person. Even for a group of people that might get frustrated. Remissioning an established church, I guarantee that you will lose some people. You will have some folks who say, you know what, I didn't sign up for this. No one told me that this was part of what it means to follow Jesus. I had somebody tell me one time they're frustrated because that change of worship time affected their golf tee time. And we're frustrated that we weren't going to accommodate a worship service time, their preference for when they got to swing the golf club. You're going to have to wrestle through that together as a community of people. But if you can't allow a group of people who are frustrated to dictate the future of your church, but you do need to press towards them for as long as you can to listen, to grow, to hear, because they're going to help you get sharper, because deep down they're experiencing some loss and doubt because what they thought church was isn't there anymore. And so you want to bring them along as far as you can, but you can't do their work for them. They got to do their own work, and they have to be willing to experience their own transformation in that process too.
Wow. Great answers. I want to throw this time 2 questions at you. One of them is, what is the place that other staff, like associate pastors, youth pastors, music ministers, have in remissioning? So that's one question. And the second question is, we have a leader who basically inherited an older church with an old building, had low attendance, little money, and while they've had some growth, and they're moving towards transformation and holistic discipleship, there's this nagging problem of money and needing to grow numerically in order to have the resources to be able to sustain, the ministry. Could you speak to both of those pieces?
Yeah, absolutely. So I do think that there's a deep role for associate staff or folks that aren't the lead pastor in remissioning. In fact, for me, it was critical to build a team in that way. So I've got a number of other pastoral staff, and every single one of them is way better at some things than I am. In fact, that's part of why I hired them, because they help decentralize the power from me being the only one who can think about worship in a new way, or think about students and family life in a different way, or the administration of the building in a creative way. It was really important to me that the staff had not only a different skill set, but that I learned how to lay down some of my own power so that they could lead and shine in the ways that God has equipped them to lead. That being said, it's really important in a remissioning situation for the lead pastor and the associate staff to be as close to a similar page as possible. In my previous context, in a church planning situation, one of the ways that I was an associate staff person, one of the ways that the senior pastor sort of utilized me in that role was to actually allow me to do some of the disruption and innovative experiments, because then that senior pastor had a little bit more freedom for it to not blow back directly on them. And they're not going to, when you're an associate staff person, you can actually take a little bit of different heat and it doesn't blow up in the same way. And so that's actually a way that you can be good teammates for each other. You can be empowered and resourced by a lead pastor, and the associate staff can actually have a little bit more freedom to experiment and help the church to, from the margins, start to adopt some new ways of being church right in the center. The other question was, what happens when the money's running out, right? Yeah. This is going to sound trite, but if you think this is trite, I'm sorry. You have to really start to pray about how to steward the resources that you have that sometimes feel like an incredible burden. We literally pray over our building, HVAC units, roofs. Buildings are really, really complicated and really, really expensive. I know more about HVAC units in the last 4.5 years in this established church than I ever wanted to know. And I know how expensive they are, and it scares me sometimes. It is there are a lot of ways that you can be creative. And one of those things is that you can look for grants that can allow you to accomplish some ministry ends. So like recently, my church got a grant to work with a historically Black Baptist church a couple blocks from us to connect worship to everyday life and bridge some racial divides. And so we have $18,000 that didn't come from our church that allows us to do really important work to being on mission in our community. And that didn't cost our church anything financially that way. And so be creative to look for ways that you might find resources to do the ministry work. I would also say that find people who are really good in your community. Go find business leaders who have a reputation for being really shrewd and have an innocence about them in terms of how they manage their building and space. Because a church isn't the only game in town that's had to figure out how to be shrewd with resources. Go find people and learn from them. Ask them. They might know people that can help resource your building and your space in ways you never thought of, because in an established church, we get so fearful about money that we just usually cling on to what we have instead of getting help from other people.
I love that, Josh. And even to think about community development, what that could look like to utilize the space on the other days of the week in a way that is actually providing resource back into the church, are some creative ways that we can think about that. This may be our last question. We have a few more, so we'll see depending on how long it takes for us to kind of unpack this one. But what's the best way to get started with the remissioning process?
So I think one of the best ways to start in an established church is to be more intentional with the opportunities that are right in front of you. So in an established church, you've got a bazillion and one teams, committees, meetings going on all the time. And that's part of the reason why there's no time for mission, is because you're in meetings till 10 o'clock at night, 3 days a week. What would it look like to, instead of just going to a meeting to talk about finances and to talk about stewardship of the building, to talk about personnel, what if you actually were intentional in that space to have a moment, 10, 15 minutes, where you can actually discuss a principle of what it looks like to be on mission with God through that team, through that committee, so that they begin to orient their work around something bigger than simply survival or just accomplishing a task, and just start to see their work in the scope of the bigger story of what God's up to. One of the things that I think is really critical is to not just read books, but to actually develop relationships. Established churches are famous for thinking that they've done something when all they've done is had a Bible study about it. Now, awareness is important, don't get me wrong, but if you're not actually changing the way you relate to people and starting to bear fruit, you can have 1,000,001 Bible studies, but maybe we should stop doing some of those and maybe actually live in proximity and relationship with folks. So one of the easiest ways is to, if you feel like you're stuck in what your mission as a church should be, find 10 people and just think like a missionary for a day, and drive, walk if you can, and go look for the places where God seems to be at work and you're missing out, or the places where it seems like people are really struggling, that God might be asking you to show up because you now have the eyes to see or that you used to hear. And then ask God for wisdom about what one step look like. Don't come in to try to be the savior of that situation or that group of people, but simply say, God, what does it look like for us to be present to your presence already here? And then take a step. Maybe it looks like bringing donuts on a Friday morning to parents as they're dropping their kids off in town, where they just are in such a rush all the time. They never slow down and see each other. Maybe it looks like a number of businesses in your main town, like your main street, are closing down. What would it look like to actually care for those business leaders who are sad that this thing that they had so much pride in is going away? What would it look like to show up in that space? This could actually connect to the financial piece. What would it look like for your church to actually think about creating a social entrepreneurship in one of those spaces as a way to be present in the business community? But be mindful, think like a missionary, think like, what does it look like for us to learn the language of this place, and then take a step in relationship, not just in content download.
Wow. Lots of excellent nuggets. The past got in my eyes. Think like a missionary. Embrace the cross. Thanks so much, Josh.